Can the US EPA's renewable fuel standard be amended to reduce and minimize market vulnerabilities and increase transparency? So we've got regulatory and oversight changes that we really need to meet a lot of the environmental goals of the renewable fuel standards. There's a report on fraud in renewable fuels market that came out for Valero Energy Corporation. Valero is part of the lawsuit against EPA's renewable fuel standards. We have an enforcement initiative in the renewable fuels sector. There's a white paper that targets fraud in the renewable fuels market. It's a report that was prepared for Valero, and it should be noted that Valero is part of the lawsuit against the Environmental Protection Agency on the renewable fuel standard. We've got a lot of key issues with renewable fuel standards that are causing fraud to occur. There are three areas that are really kind of fixable. First point is that it's really a matter of having effective oversight resources. The Environmental Protection Agency has disinvested a lot of our enforcement resources in recent years, and it's really difficult to be the cop on the beat if there aren't enough cops for the beat. Secondly, the market for RANs is tremendously opaque. It's unlike any other commodity market out there in terms of people being able to understand where and how these RANs are generated. So increasing transparency is incredibly important. And thirdly, we have to take a hard look at renewable fuel standard regulations. Currently, the program is set up with a really obtuse sounding point called the point of obligation. That area has really become the focus of where I think you can make a difference in fraud and in compliance. Currently, refiners and importers are responsible. They're responsible parties for essentially buying the RANs at the end of every year, but they have essentially little or no influence on how renewable fuel is blended and overseen. That's really a fundamental problem in the market that I think is continuing to make it open for fraud and exploitation. There's a lot of ongoing fraud happening, and this fraud becomes more sophisticated, or as it becomes more sophisticated at time. I'd say initially when we saw this back in 2010 and 2011, I characterized it almost as like a mom and pop fraud that made a lot of money. Individual folks were able to essentially hang out a shingle, claim they were producing renewable fuel when they weren't, and these folks simply generated credits and then sold them. The Environmental Protection Agency focused more on it. There was some level of third-party verification, and certainly criminal enforcement increased with EPA's Criminal Division, Department of Justice, and so on. The agency itself thought as it moved to increase this third-party verification and oversight that criminals looked at the amount of money in the renewable fuel sector and they became more sophisticated. So sometimes we'd see multiple schemes where a lot of different entities across the country were organized to ship fuel that didn't have RANs but claimed it had RANs, and they created these massive bookkeeping scams all to the tune of making hundreds of millions of dollars illegally. So as the Environmental Protection Agency tried to tighten up the regulations, these fraudsters got increasingly more complicated, more complex, and in my view, the way it's structured with the current point of obligation, the door remains open for fraud. This fraud can go well beyond what's been reported in the media. I think really what you'll see in the media is that everyone's been formally charged, and anyone in the law enforcement or the prosecutorial world will tell you that what's public is not the full picture of what's going on. So there's clearly ongoing criminal investigations. There's going to be more prosecutions to come. So for those who would say, like, look, the problem really has been solved, I don't think that's an accurate picture of it. It's largely been focused on biodiesel, but I think what you'll see is the agency is increasing the requirements for renewable fuel, and particularly ethanol. We have regulations that are structured so that if there becomes a shortage of ethanol RANs, then those who need RANs can go down and buy diesel RANs. You can essentially go backwards in that, but you can't use ethanol RANs to support biodiesel RANs. Now, it sounds a little complicated, but what basically this tells us that the fraud has been centered in the biodiesel market, and the market is about to dramatically increase because those who have to go out and buy RANs can essentially buy biodiesel RANs to make up for the scarcity in ethanol RANs. So, Driving this ethanol market further will drive the scarcity and will drive people into a market that's been susceptible to fraud. There's initial indicators that there may even be collusion by auditors to conceal fraud in the sector. Based on what we've got for historical patterns that we've seen, the agency responded in a rulemaking fashion early on by having third-party engineers come in and assess a facility to say basically, this facility in fact can make this amount of biodiesel. You need a strong check on the system. The EPA found that engineers can collude in certain instances and they can be part of a criminal scheme. I'd anticipate that we'd see similar collusion further down the road with different auditors. I think in some of the more recent criminal cases we've seen with the QAP program, the auditors themselves have been kind of fooled and hoodwinked. So there are cases where some may make the unwise decision to be involved in criminal conduct. We've also seen that it's by no means a foolproof program. We've got fraud that benefits the program's emission reduction goals. Several years ago, a colleague indicated that kind of back of the envelope, that even back in 2011 when the fraud was emerging, they estimated it was in terms of like the fraud probably contributed an additional 2 coal power plants in effect to emissions that weren't being reduced. These are massive emissions. So as fraud accelerates, you can imagine smart folks get their back of the envelope estimates again and figure out what the lack of carbon reduction is coming from, from a insufficient program. I think it's an important story to tell here. If you have a inefficient program that's not going to meet policy goals, including reducing greenhouse gases, you have a critical policy goal in reducing greenhouse gases. Can the program be restructured to make it a better place? Is there a political appetite to fix all these things? Who knows? There isn't going to be a political appetite next year. Folks certainly get invested in different programs as they get more and more established. I think it makes sense from a policy standpoint to revisit this issue, and it can be visited in a way that enhances policy goals, which is continued energy independence and a reduction in greenhouse gases. But you have to build a highly functioning regulatory program in order to accomplish some of these things. EPA is not attuned to overseeing markets like the Securities Exchange Commission or CFTC is. This is a different program than the EPA is generally used to focusing on. But with the right types of regulatory changes and the right level of oversight, you can get to the policy goals you need and really continue to advance biofuels as part of our energy mix. That's it for today. As countries work to strike a balance between climate adaptation and mitigation efforts,